wherever you'd like to start. All yours, mate.
Thanks, Rob. So yeah, the place that I think is the most obvious place to start is what we actually mean by artificial intelligence. We'll get on to data because it's ultimately going to be the big thing that unlocks all of that. But too many people, I think, start thinking of chatbots first or terminators, and primarily, especially because of the news and how it's a hot topic, the sort of the more sentient kind of wider AI. So yeah, Phil, do you want to elaborate on what we mean by sort of the narrow AI that we look at typically in our roles?
Yeah, I think your two examples there of chatbots and terminators are a great two ends of the spectrum, actually, because they're linked very closely in that, what was it, the T-800 was an infiltration unit, right? So it had to go in and interact with humans naturally to progress the goals of Skynet. And as everybody knows, chatbots do exactly the same thing. They infiltrate the conversation with the customer in a positive way to automate parts of that. So I don't think those are wrong identifications of artificial intelligence, but all of them are on a spectrum. So, AI started with, in business, you can think spam filtering was an early use of it. We're not talking about the sort of academic or military applications, but you've all got spam filters in your email systems now. That was an early application of artificial intelligence. And I'm going to make a separation here between artificial intelligence, machine learning, and machine intelligence. We'll come back to those three, I think. So machine learning is machines learning from data to produce a model. It's just another way of producing a piece of software. Artificial intelligence is where you put that into a system to make decisions and take actions for you. So chatbots having a conversation all the way through to recommendation engines and anything that makes a decision with that model, really. The machine intelligence on the other end is where we start to redefine what it means to be intelligent, based on the machine not trying to copy a human, but to exist in the world in its own right.
And the more you go along that spectrum to the greater levels of intelligence that the software is able to reproduce, is when you get into the ethics of the side of things. So I know yourself, you're involved in a lot of the kind of responsible AI, sort of co-author of the book, and looking at sort of data empathy and comparing how data is used in software with data in humans and things like that. So do you want to tell a bit about your story there and the work you're doing in that area?
Yeah, so this really meshes nicely with the three different ways that we're talking about looking at it there, all the way through to the ideas of terminators, right? Because you've got to think in three dimensions. First one is building AI responsibly. Yeah, so we'll come back to that probably when we talk about data in great depth. The next one is building responsible AI. So when you do have this automated system, how do you have that concept of, ethical behavior built into what that machine chooses to do? And then right at the other end of that spectrum, you have this idea of treating AI ethically. If we are going to have this idea of this other intelligence that is automated and interacting in our environment, are we treating those systems in an ethical manner? And it gets close to the idea of animal ethics and those things as well. And so you have this broad spectrum again here. Most of the work at the moment's on that building AI responsibly. And that's really about the human teams wrapped around that. So do you have the right ethical principles in place? Microsoft we make a lot of the principles we have and how they're made real. But also you've got to ask the questions about the teams that are building those systems, right? Do you have a diverse set of perspectives in there? Do you have people of the right kind of backgrounds? Do you have narrow skills from a technology perspective? PhDs in machine learning and things like that are fantastic. But what about the digital humanities? What about the digital sociologists and the anthropologists and the people who understand the impact of systems on the world of work and the world of humanity?
I'll just jump in there. So today's A-level day, right? An absolute horror show, I hear, for people with teenagers who are no doubt not in their most friendly states at the moment, from the sound of it. So there's a whole separate tangent about could data and AI have done a better job of grading all those kids? The answer is almost certainly yes, but we won't go down that road. The question I was going to ask Phil is, and Andy as well, really, is do you guys think that actually as this industry develops, data and AI become more commonplace in the years ahead, actually the demand will be far greater than it is today for those other softer roles, you know, the more human side of it, as opposed to the raw technology roles? Because I think so far there's been this real arms race for the PhD, data science, machine learning, you know, super smart kind of data analyst type people. But it does seem like in the future, the other side of it is going to be as important. Well, what do you guys think there? Is there a skill shortage to come?
So I want to call up another fictional example here, which is being made all too real recently. So Isaac Asimov wrote the robot stories, you know, early science fiction, great reads, and we hear about the laws of robotics as they are there. A character in those stories, which I think represents the answer to your question, Rob, is Dr. Susan Calvin. She was a robo-psychologist, and it was her job to work out why the machines were going wrong when they had these laws of robotics in place. And that role, we're seeing that laid bare now. In all the work that's happening in ethics, people say, well, we have these laws and rules and principles. Why are the machines failing? All the way through to how the machines operate in society. So fiction, again, science fiction, gave us a pointer in that way. But I believe that it's not next, it's right now. If a business is integrated to start to automate things and answer questions, if you don't have the digital humanities represented within that process, you're setting yourself up for more business risk. And this really is, it comes right down to, you know, everybody, the three things, right? Risk, more revenue, and reduce costs. This is about a business risk now. It's gone from an idea and not wanting the headlines through to direct impact on your business. And if there aren't people working on that, from now, when you're using these technologies, you're going to get yourself into trouble.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think when you look at what's to come in terms of artificial intelligence, I think that there's a big change coming that all businesses are going to have to adapt to, not just businesses, but the entire industry surrounding that as well. If you look at when the car came around, sort of, if you look at the kind of, there's a book from Microsoft, The Future Computed, which puts it really nicely. But yeah, when the car came around, it impacted lots of other industries that were unforeseen. Things like advertising changed to billboards, so people can read those whilst driving a car. And I think you're going to have similar impacts from AI becoming more prevalent in the software that we're using. That it's not going to just impact the obvious, but other things around that, like legals and lots of other industries, are going to be impacted as people sort of adopt these technologies more.
And I think that goes to it. It's not just the skills you hire we're talking about here. It's the skills that spread out within the business. I mean, does a business leader know how to make decisions in the world where AI is part of that business? Do they know how it impacts different teams? Because what will happen is that new generations will come into the business and they'll have expectations from this new world that Andrew describes, you know, from their social media, their phone, their computer, their games, all of these things, which all of us in technology have had. I may have been sitting there with a Sega Mega Drive or those kind of things, but they taught me things about what to expect of the world. And so you come into business and you come into an organization, and this is why there's often that rift, because the leaders, who quite often are older, they're a different generation, don't know how to learn and adapt from people coming into their business, who are younger, for example, who probably have skills that would help the business straight away if they just knew how to unlock it.
Cool. So for the people that don't really get to see the day-to-day that we do, Phil, and it's pretty close with things like envisioning sessions and running workshops to getting people to broaden their expectations of what you can do with technology now, and then looking at specific. Very well, the technology can do great things, and as a technologist I can get excited by that, but it's when you provide that as a solution to something that actually makes real world impact that really makes me light up and makes me really proud of what I do. So do you want to give an example or two of things that are real world implementations using artificial intelligence that you've been involved in?
So there's the ones I've been involved in, which are kind of harder for me to talk about, right? Because I work with a lot of different businesses here, but I'm going to abstract to an example I like to use quite a lot, because I think it talks to a lot of the work that I do, and then I'll use one from the research space, which I think is the kind of way people need to be thinking. So the first one is a public case study of ours around water usage on ships. It may sound kind of dry, but if you extrapolate this to the idea that fresh water is at a premium, there we have a reduction in fresh water across the world, and the conditions for getting fresh water to people are becoming harder. But we were commenting earlier about how warm it is at the moment, but there's a huge impact, and water security is important. If you boil that down to a business example, this was, I think, the saving using machine learning to plan water on ships for people to drink. When they put a machine learning system in place to optimize how water was distributed across their fleet, they saved $200,000 per ship per year. So that's a direct business impact for them. Saving that amount of money is really important. We can extrapolate that into the world where we look at, if machine learning can do that on ships, machine learning can start to look at water security for people in other ways. Another example which I like is there's a case study with the Ordnance Survey about using satellite images to recognize roof types. So this is a computer vision application where machine learning is trained to recognize roof types and to update mapping data. That was somewhat inspired by using computer vision techniques to detect the emergence of illegal small-scale mining. Now, illegal small-scale mining has an impact on society and the ecology in a particular area as well. But each of these big examples, we talk about envisioning, right? So when you hear about that big case study that somebody did, it's not only about that one example, it's about how you can see the assets in the data that you have where you could apply the same thing. What pictures and photography do you have within your business? How is your water usage or your energy usage or some other aspect of your supply chain represented in data within your business? Because water is just one aspect. If you've got a supply chain, other aspects, you'll need to look at the security of those commodities or aspects of your supply chain as well. And so that's what gets me really excited, is finding that big idea. Detecting illegal small-scale mines is one big idea, but what that represents is something that's being done. And if it's been done, there'll be open source projects around it, there'll be documentation of what happened, which really starts to make it available to more people in the industry.
Yeah, I've seen that firsthand as well. So the Microsoft, and we are talking a lot about Microsoft, but obviously that's as expected with Phil on the call. So yeah, that's what they get for providing us a Phil. The Microsoft AI for Earth grant, I've seen firsthand how that can help. So we ran a workshop here at the Wirelive HQ for some of our agency partners, and the beauty of working with agencies is they've got such wide reach, because we don't necessarily verticalize ourselves, but all of our partners do, and some of them work on some really great projects. And one of our partners who was coming to the workshop, I showed some of the examples with the AI for Earth and some of the APIs that are being used from some of the in development cognitive services to recognize animals based on the sort of outline of fins for marine biology. And so the snow leopard one is a great example as well, where a camera can be sitting there and AI can be sifting through the data to find when there was a snow leopard there or another animal that's moving by. And they said, oh, that's interesting, because we're trying at the moment to write our own thing to be able to track this pod of dolphins in the North Sea. And if you extrapolate the science going on with that pod, it turns out you can infer better insights about the whole marine ecosystem in that area, and then what's going on in the rest of the world as well. So they were quite intrigued to see how it was working. Through our contacts at Microsoft, we got them in touch with the same people that are working on the other side of the globe, doing the same work, and the technology is being shared between them because it's an open source project, which is just amazing to be that dot, to be able to connect people up, to be able to leverage this and make a real difference to the world. So that's a great thing. Another side from my side is conversational AI, and we talk about chatbots, and everyone comes to us wanting a chatbot because maybe their friend's got one, or the company they work with has one, or a competitor. They're looking to sort of gain an advantage in the market. But what's really nice is we worked with a charity to scope how they would do how they would implement that with their current call center. Their phones are ringing off the hook, so every month they would have a certain number of calls, vulnerable people or not. So putting a conversational AI in place that can field some of those more frequently asked questions through a simple chatbot reduced the number of calls in by sort of 30 to 40%, meaning that not only were they able to field all of the calls, but now they had a team that had some time available to make proactive outbound calls to a prioritized list of who the most vulnerable people is. So that's quite a change to the level of service they were able to deliver. And given a charity that were looking after vulnerable people, it's a great one to talk about. But that same logic can apply to any business looking to provide greater customer service to their customers.
And let me just jump in and say, so just to ground it in the theme. So Andy and Phil talk so fluently about this stuff. I think it's easy to miss some of the detail. So I think each of those examples illustrates an opportunity where a business was able to stop making bad decisions because of the insight they were able to glean ultimately from data in lots of different ways. And I think that it's kind of a hard thing to frame, like, why does a business still make a poor decision? Because actually a lot of businesses don't even realize that they are doing that, right? Like, take the charity example. They weren't able to ascertain which calls they should answer and which calls they should spend more time on. Arguably, therefore, they were making bad decisions, right? Because they were having to guess at where they should spend their time. Now, without any awareness that there's an alternative, they wouldn't be sitting there thinking, oh man, we're making bad decisions about which calls we should answer every day. It's just how it is, right? But then once you start to understand what the opportunities are, and I think this speaks to what Phil was saying about the water example, when you hear these stories we're telling, don't think, oh, well, I don't have a water supply chain, so this isn't relevant to me. Start to think about, well, hang on a minute. What is there that's going on in my business that I could optimize to achieve significant cost saving? Where am I not able to make a really informed decision about how much of something I buy or how I allocate it, right? Or in the context of the Ordnance Survey and computer vision example for the mining, like, don't just think about, oh, well, what photography do you currently have in your organization and what images do you have? Because actually there are loads of amazing ways to capture images these days. Like, there's a service that you can use now to get satellite imagery really, really easily and quite low cost from a private company of anywhere in the world. And you can have it multiple times a day. You can have it once a day. You can have it, like slightly offset 3D, or you can have just top down with like geothermal. There's loads of different options there. So actually, I don't know, let's say you owned a field and you wanted to know something about what was going on in that field every day, and then you wanted to inform something as a result of that. You could do all of that relatively easily now by piecing all of these different pieces of technology together in this kind of increasingly open source world that we have. So I just wanted to kind of bring it back to that, because I think it's maybe not obvious where those poor decisions are sometimes.
Yeah, I think... Go on, Phil.
No, I was just going to... please, Andy, go ahead. I'll chip in after.
So one thing that I like to talk about, although it becomes more controversial and it becomes sort of, if you haven't seen it firsthand, it's really difficult to explain. But I think it's important to talk about why AI is better than humans in certain examples. Obviously, we as humans have to be fed, we have to be watered. A lot of us have to have our coffee and all of the other hits we need to be able to get us up in the morning to be able to be on form. Software doesn't need that. So software, whether it's AI or not, will do what it's programmed to do very consistently every time. And I think you can rely on that consistency then to make better decisions in its own. But also it's much better at comprehending, or not even needing to comprehend, much more complex calculations. So I'm not going to put you on the spot, Phil, but if I was to ask you a few calculations on the spot, and then as we add more and more and more, that gets increasingly complex. And AI just doesn't get in the same sort of stress we get when we get put under more and more with more complex calculations to be made. And I think that makes a huge difference in how it can give us much better insights.
I think there's a really good space that you've outlined there, both Rob and Andy, right? So one of the reasons I think people make bad decisions is because they go, let's get some new data. That's where we start with an AI project. And that can be bad. And I think Rob gave a great example there, which is satellite images will help us, because we said that example. Having those images don't necessarily help you make a better decision. It just means that you have more data. What you need to get into is that cyclic idea of we've got some data. That data is being used for something. So you might have a CRM, you might have just some customer comments coming in. If we take the charity example, they've now not only got a better way of interacting with people, they've now got a data set about those interactions which they didn't have before. So at any point, you want to be able to look at the data that you've got and ask what you know from it and what else you could know from it. And quite often people miss that second step. They don't take the time to look at the data and say, what else could we know from this? We know that, for example, let's take Rob's example. We know we can see where there's browning in the different crops in that field. Now, we can see that by looking at the images, so we can check that. But actually, how that browning changes throughout the year could be a really important signal. It's a different kind of processing. And looking at, let's say you've got 365 of those photographs, and maybe you've got 10 fields. Now you've got a multiple of 365, 10 times as many maybe. And it gets harder and harder to look. But you can still use that resource with AI to know something new. You knew something before, there's always something new you can get out of it. When you start to get into that cycle, then adding new data becomes really powerful. You start to go, okay, so we've got these chat interactions, they're useful. What time of day can we record that? What else can we get from the user at that point to help us make a better and better decision? Then just as you said earlier, Andy, that's where you start to need to think about your ethical principles, because it's really easy for technical people to go down the rabbit hole there. You start going, oh, we captured the face of everybody who came into our shop, and we start to use that, and we could do age detection, we could do gender detection, we could do race detection, we could start to do all of these things and serve them better. Suddenly you're sitting on a massively questionable data set that contains details about a person. And that person might not have given you consent to hold that. Your intention was good, but you've walked yourself to a difficult position. If you ask yourself, what could we know? What else could we know from this data set? You both find new value, but you also start to have that question point, that point to pause to see where there may be problems brewing. Things you haven't thought about, ethical questions you haven't necessarily asked. So I think that's really key. AI is very exciting, but ask yourself at each point, what do we know because of this data, and what else could we know? Because it points you in a much better direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. That exact example of the shop wanting to take sort of image recognition to understand who people were and how they were traveling around the shop. We've done that as well with a partner that thanks to the way that the cognitive services APIs for face detection work, means that you don't have to store a picture of anyone's face. You can, in real time, get a face ID, which is just a unique identifier for that person. You delete the image straight away. It doesn't even get stored anywhere. And then that ID can be tracked around the store, which is completely anonymous. You can look at what products they were looking at, their sentiment of how they interacted with the most exciting products potentially. And as they're leaving the store, there could be a prompt on a point of sale screen there saying, looks like you enjoyed these products more. Would you like us to email you about them? And then completely anonymously, you can track that experience. You can leverage all of this artificial intelligence without having to worry about the PII and the GDPR side of things. You can have it completely consensual and opted in and part of a unique experience in sort of the modern way that stores can potentially using these things. So,
and that's where we get into the point I think Rob was making earlier, that it opens up these new questions, these new avenues. If you're into your design theory, these new affordances, things you could lock onto. And then you start to cross over with this idea of the relationship with the customer. This is where marketing might get involved. You might look at your user researchers, your sociologists, all the way through. If it's just the data team looking at this, if it's just the data team saying we could do this and going off technically, you lose that loop. And if you think about any of those retail experiences, you may have a question which is answered on the shop floor. It may be answered by the people who designed the website or the call experience or the phone system. And if you don't get that loop of asking other people, having that interdisciplinary team thinking about AI scenarios, you lose both the opportunities, but also the additional risks that you're building in there.
And I think that speaks to to this challenge of like, how do you build a data practice and who's responsible for it, and like, and maybe we'll move on to that area of the conversation now as we get towards a kind of an end game of, well, how do you do this, right? So I think one of the things we found has really disrupted some of our projects recently, slightly frustratingly, if I'm being frank, is we've said, well, who's your chief data officer? And you know, you're in a meeting with the leadership team of a partner, and the call just sort of stops, right? And everyone sort of looks at each other. Well, it's not me. Is it you? Like, well, I'm not a data person. What is data? You know, like there's this whole, it's this kind of scary word. And I think data is one of those words that when it gets used in a sentence, everyone shuts up because they feel like if they ask a question, it makes them look stupid, being frank. Like, I think my view is that data has become this thing that people sort of throw around to mean lots of different things. And actually, quite often, no one's willing to put their hand up and say, what do you actually mean, right? When you're talking about data, are we talking about an image? Are we talking about an audio recording? Are we talking about a Face ID fingerprint? Are we talking about, you know, like there's so many things it can mean, almost infinite different possibilities. And I think that quite often what we see is that businesses aren't anywhere near getting any value from a lot of these tools because they're not even sure who's responsible for the data they've got in the first place, let alone what they're going to do with it and how they're going to turn it into insight that helps them make better decisions. So I know that you both chaps spend a lot of time talking about data practice in organizations and how to build that in and all the different parts and components of it. Let's open it up on that for a little bit. So let's just talk about this challenge of data. Like, what do you, Phil, why don't you start? Like, what do you think the big challenges are for any organization that's trying to get a handle on this data question?
So it's a really good example because, as Andy mentioned earlier, one of my areas of sort of study and things like that is data empathy. And this is exactly to that point, that data went from this exciting thing. Everybody was talking about big data and it was a high-skilled activity, and everybody looked at their spreadsheet and went, well, that's not very big. I obviously aren't special. But actually, it's they were made to not feel special. And anybody in a business, they're processing data all the time. So anybody in a sales role, they're processing data, let's say from LinkedIn, from the emails they got from the customer. It's a different kind of data processing than somebody who runs a database might think about. But they kind of get into these blocking scenarios where they're sitting in a meeting and go, we should do this because my spreadsheet is this and I just got an email from Sally who works for this customer. And the data person goes, well, that's not really data though, is it? It's not in our database and we've only got one example of that. So it's not statistically significant. And you get into these, there's no empathy flowing there. There's no people listening to the scenario and how they could help. And so I think that that leads to what you described as data being a scary word, right? And GDPR was unhelpful in that. GDPR is a fantastic opportunity to tidy some of these things up within a business, but suddenly you're the chief data officer, GDPR is your thing, so now that's your thing. Don't ask me to answer any questions, I'm just here for GDPR. And you go, hang on a second, the spirit of a chief data officer is somebody who goes, how does this business know things? How does everyone from the data team, the data scientists, to the sales team and marketing, how do they know things and how do we marshal that? And that takes a huge amount of empathy to understand what people need in their role. And so I think the problem of making a poor decision, which, this is the premise of what we're talking about, is that people feel locked into the data that they're able to use. And they go, well, I'll make this decision because this is what I'm allowed to see and this is what it's telling me. And then when you go, well, that's a bad decision. You're missing this huge thing. They say, oh, I'm not a data person. The data person gave me this. And that comes down to what's known as data literacy. The ability to feel like, literacy in terms of books is the freedom to read books. Data literacy is the freedom to use data as a resource to help you know things. And if the business doesn't support everybody who works there in their data literacy, then you're going to get the problems that you described. Sorry, a bit of a monologue. You kind of touched on some triggered topics for me there.
it's great, and we've got time. Let's talk more about this. I mean, Andy, you've spent a lot of time recently writing up data strategies, right, and taking businesses on that kind of consulting journey to try to figure out what their data strategy is. What's your experience been like?
Yeah, so the latest kind of change to my role and how I end up doing it is a lot more around the strategy and business strategy. Frankly, it's nothing really to do with the technology when we first start to write the groundwork for these things. So been reading lots of books on sort of business strategy from leaders in the industry and things like that, and it all comes down ultimately to think of your data as assets. And great businesses that are growing fast invest in their assets and make money from those. So it's about monetizing that data ultimately, to however that works, whether that's actually selling your data or actually, more often than not, it's about understanding how it best impacts the business to be able to make the business just generally more performant. So we've done lots of work on that. We get to look at whether data is at the top table is normally the biggest thing. So is the C-suite of a business looking at data? And I'm not talking about do they have a KPI dashboard. It's deeper than that. It's about understanding when they have the strategy meetings for the next quarter or the next 3 years goals. Are they looking at how they achieve that with the use of data through the business? Are they looking at, do they have the right data to even know if they've achieved that when it comes to the end? And if so, are we using that today to make sure we can track our progress and look at how they're using that? All sorts of things from businesses now as well, as we start to get into this era where things like Power BI are opening up reporting and insights to the end user. So we've gone from an IT first reporting back in the day. So IT teams within a business would completely own the insights practice. We've then moved up a level to business analyst being involved in that. So there's an analyst team or a BI team that are responsible for the reporting, and the IT control the governance and security of the data. Now we've got things like Power BI that puts the report writing capability in the hands of any business team that's frankly closer to the customer, and that makes a real big difference because those people know more about the day-to-day running of the business than anyone. So if you can give those people the right data, it's about democratizing the data assets to be able to make anyone have the ability to really understand what they want to learn from that.
I think there's a great example here which ties the AI story in, because yes, you can do this as a human level, you can do it with machine learning, you can create AI systems. But I want to tell a little story about a workshop. It was a day-long workshop that we were doing. I went down to help one of our partners, and they got the customer in the room with the promise of AI on their data, something special, something magical. But we set up the day where the morning the customer brought some data that they thought, this is just what we've got. It's not exciting. We were going to use AI on it and tell them something exciting. By lunchtime, we had the customer, the end customer, on their feet, pointing at the screen at the end of the room, talking about the chart that we put up there. Because we worked really hard on making it relevant to what they wanted to know. And they said, how did you do this? What AI got you that chart? And said, this is just a chart of the data you came with. And they're like, we didn't know we could know that. And this is, this is the feeling I seek with data. When you're in a room where this is, top table people all the way through, and you do something with data that makes people stand up. They may just, I don't like the term lean in, but that's fashionable at the moment, right? They lean in, they stand up, they ask that. I had a call recently where somebody said, I know it's selfish, can you show me on that dashboard? That was the moment where you know that the dashboard is now working. Then, in that, going back to that workshop, in the afternoon, we added some more interesting things with AI, and they were always like, oh, okay, that's interesting, yes, but that thing we did in the morning was the main point. And when you're analyzing data, if you can't get that response, if you go in and say, please tell us what you want on the dashboard, and the people go, we'd like to know these things. You go away for 3 months, you come back, you show them the dashboard, and they go, what we want has kind of changed. It's not living. It's not alive in the business. It's not that asset being used. In the same way that if you employ a data scientist, they cost you a huge amount of money. They come to a meeting, and every meeting they don't tell you something exciting. They go, oh, we've got a data quality issue over here. The governance is bad. I can't get access to this. Then you end up sitting there going, why have we got a data scientist? All they do is they make us unhappy because they don't tell us things. And it's because that cycle, that relationship with data is not there. Once you've got that moving, you can put AI on the top of it really usefully. And then AI is exciting. But it's exactly that. You've got the strategy to get people excited. Everybody buys into that. It's not just governance. It's not just GDPR. It's that feeling where you go in and you go, we can make people excited with this asset, as you called it.
And actually, so our CTO thinks that in the future, tools like Power BI will be as commonplace as Excel is today, right? That these low-code, no-code solutions and these sort of easy self-serve tools are becoming so sort of pervasive and relevant to the work that everybody does every day that they're going to replace the traditional spreadsheets and associated systems of old. And I think that we've seen that start to happen in our own business and also for some of the partners we've worked with. But the big step is about how you make all that data available to people in a way they feel comfortable consuming it. And I think that is not simple a lot of the time, right? That's the bit that still requires really specialist skills and expertise. Like if I was at a dinner with another CEO and they said, look, where do I start? I'd say, honestly, pay a great consultant to come in and just get your data sorted. So you've got a practice that means it's available to people when they want it and they understand where it is and what it is as well. And then just let them get on with it, right? And like that's how at Wirelive we often start these projects. Is we've figured out that's the way you do it. You go in and you actually train the people on how to get their own insights. You teach them how to fish. Really, you say, look, we'll dig your pond for you and we'll fill it with cod and no one catches cod with a fishing rod. That's a terrible analogy. Let's say that they're beautiful salmon, right? And you set it all up for people, but then ultimately you leave them with that legacy, which is their own ability. And so I think that data practice development stuff is really interesting and important because it leads to the outcome that we're all here to talk about, really, which is, well, how do you get to that end where people can genuinely start, like you say, stand up out of their seat and realize, I can actually answer a question I couldn't previously answer. I can know things I didn't know I could know. You phrased it more eloquently than that. So let's go there with this conversation, right? Let's get to so what are those steps that you guys have both seen? What's the critical path to get from the beginning of an engagement with a business where they've got no idea what they're doing to actually enabling their whole organization to start answering those really important questions and making better decisions?
For me, it's changing how you think about that word data. I think far too often, because it's by definition, it is the technical thing that's sitting on that file store on a hard drive somewhere, right? It's hard to think of it as that digital asset. So we almost want a different word, which I'm not actually sort of condoning because I've done a lot of work and I've named a lot of projects, data strategy and assessment and things like that recently. So let's not change all of that, but we got to change what the word means to people. I think that's the first step. It's like I say, understanding that it is a digital asset. Once you treat it like that in the business, in the same way that you're looking to get the best out of your employees and your staff, you'll want to get the best out of those digital assets as well. So you'll be making sure that you look after them, making sure that they're governed and secure. Which when you ask people, do you have data? Obviously, everyone's got data, and do you have a data strategy? Most people say yes, and it's the fact that the IT team have put some security in place to say that these people cannot access the data under any circumstance, and we will only store things for these retention periods and things like that. It is a strategy, but it's not what we mean. So understanding what we mean by those phrases is really important, and redefining that can make a massive difference to a business. So understanding that the data strategy needs to be aligned and in a cyclical process with the business strategy. So any time there's a change to one or the other has to adapt to that, and it will impact it directly. Putting things in place and putting principles in place for your business on how you want to do this, because whilst we talk internally at Wirelive about a sort of a gold standard insights-driven organization, like the dream customer to work with is the customer that wants to do all of this with their data, but that's potentially not for everyone. So you need to understand how far you're willing to take it and what you want to do with it. For example, most customers, I think, to be fair, want to put the data in the hands of everyone that needs it and want to be as transparent as possible with everything that's running through the business, because ultimately the people in the hot seat doing the jobs need their own data for what's impacting their role to make those decisions. And I think that's the trend that we're seeing more and more organizations working that way. But that has to be defined. That has to be something that's at the mindset shift in the business, to know that when you start at that organization in the induction, is like, here is the data that you get access to, and here is some reports that your colleagues have built so far, and maybe you have some other ideas that you can adapt these and build these out. It should be as much part of the day-to-day role for everyone in the business as everything else is, I think.
So I think this is all really, really valuable points, and you need to, I think the point about induction, where, when somebody's starting the business, to show how the business is data-driven is important. If you're talking about a business who is sitting there right now, listening to this and saying, what is the first thing we can do? You're going to have to take a deep breath, is really the first thing you're going to do. Because if you're asking that question and you have some data somewhere, it means that there's a gap between you and that data. So the first thing you need to do is accept the fact that if you don't have the data, you don't have the data. If it's not in your hands to work with and you're asking this data strategy question, then you're already one step removed. You go, what is our data strategy? And you can't touch data. You've got to be able to do that. So first step is to look at what data represents to you as the person who's making this decision. Do you use it, or do you have other people who use it for you? If there are other people who use it for you, so they come to you with insight, not data or reports or those things, they're the person who will need to lead the data strategy, because you're too far removed. And then the first part of that data strategy is how you, as the leader who wants this, gets closer to it. Because then you have the right people. So when you go, we need a data strategy, I'm going to lead this, but you're going to have to help me all the way. You're showing that you understand the fact that you don't know everything, that there is more to know. That starts to build trust. So the person will say, okay, we show you these reports, this is what you want to see, these are what we could show you. Then start to ask those knowledge questions. That's sort of from the top down, from the person who wants to do it. Technology will follow. I mean, at Microsoft, we have great partners like Wirelive who can help make that technology flow. But until you've got that acceptance, where you go, okay, I've got to start this journey, it's not, I will sit down and write my data strategy. You can only do that if you're able to touch each of the pieces of data and to work out how it relates to that overall strategy. So that's your first step, is you need to sit down and go, if I'm asking myself this question, what is the data I can touch?
And just to reiterate, I'm sorry if I'm flogging the horse, data in this context is every CRM record, every email address you have, every customer record, every footfall entrance to one of your retail stores, every supplier delivery, every invoice, every PO number. It's every single thing you have in your business. And that is why the analogy I like personally the best is that all businesses have an exhaust of data. There is this just stream of data billowing out the back of every modern business, whether they know it or not. And really, the decision you're making is, do you want to do something valuable with that or not? And the smart analysts in the world think that if you choose not to, you will ultimately be you will fall behind your competitors who choose to take advantage of that data, because in that exhaust is gold, right? There is so much value in there that ultimately leads to you making better decisions, which can make you more profitable or make you more competitive or give you a better customer service or whatever enhancements you want to make. And so I suppose what the three of us are saying, and certainly this is my view and what I say when I talk to people about this challenge, is you don't really have any choice. Like, if you still want to run the business you're running today or be an employee in it, or frankly, for that business to exist in 10 years' time, you have to solve this problem. It's simply an imperative. It's as simple as, like, the people that maybe chose not to use electricity when it turned up. Well, I'm sure they weren't around very long after that, right? It's such a meaningful shift in terms of what's possible. I hate to say paradigm shift, because we're not from California, but it is, right? Like, and that is what's being represented by everybody at Microsoft, by everybody at all of Microsoft's competitors, by everybody in the technology industry as a whole. And frankly, all businesses today are technology businesses, whether they like it or not, because these are the tools that they have to use to unlock the value that ultimately leads them to making better decisions. So as you can tell, we're all quite passionate about this, and I think it's because we've all seen firsthand what the impact can be, right? With both for our own businesses and for the businesses we get to work with every day. I mean, the reason I love technology is because I get to solve other people's problems, right? Like the industry that we're in means we have the luxury, in my opinion, of working on other people's really interesting problems all the time and seeing how we can make their businesses better. And whether it's helping a charity deliver better value for money on its donations to do more good in the world, or saving the dolphins, or there's like so much great stuff that happens that isn't just like making more money for a FTSE 100, and data feeds into all of that. So I suppose we're kind of getting close to time. I'm going to ask you both a really difficult to answer question that you weren't prepared for, which is, so we step into an elevator, right? And Phil, I'm going to make you go first. We step into an elevator, and you've got that classic elevator time. It's like no more than a minute or two, and you say, "Oh yeah, I do this great data stuff," and someone says, "Oh cool, where would I start?" Like if you had to boil it down to a paragraph on where you start, what would you say? How do I make better decisions with data?
First of all, revisit the data you have. Know what you can know from it, and then ask a different question. If you really do that, come back to me, you'll be excited, and we'll take the next step.
We've arrived at floor 8 with seconds to spare. Andy, a tough act to follow. Where would you go with it?
What Phil said. Yeah, I agree with the looking at what data you have. I think lots of people will want to talk about AI. No one's ever come to a data and AI workshop for the data, I think, and that often they leave knowing about the data. So I'd say come to one of our data and AI workshops. You will talk about the cool AI stuff, and guess what? You'll learn all of the most valuable stuff will be the data that you take away from that, and a change of understanding of what data means, what decisions mean, and that can really make a massive difference to every business out there listening.
We went to a slightly higher floor for that one, but I think we still squeezed it in under the wire. And I mean, clearly the message you should take away if you're still here enjoying this episode is that you should come to one of our data and AI workshops. I think that's what Andy's really saying. But look, joking apart, I hope that we have given anybody watching, listening to this, something to think about, right? When it comes to what they're doing today with data, what they might be able to do, what don't they know? What could they know? What insights lie in that unrefined pile of what looks like dirt but actually is gold? And what are the steps they could take to start to unlock it, I think is what I would hope people take away from this. I think we should end where we finish. Sorry, we should finish where we began, rather, which is by teasing Phil about some of his icebreaker questions. So as we've covered already, Phil would describe himself in just 3 words as a bearded philosophy bear. Teasing is probably a little bit unfair. Phil, tell us about your amazing music that you make, because I see you tweeting about it a lot and I often listen to it. And I would say it's a mixed bag, it's probably fair to say. Some of it's great though. Tell us a bit about the music stuff you do.
So I think this is going back to the philosophy bit, right? If you read Schopenhauer, right, everybody says that he's a pessimist, but he says that there are 3 ways out of the tragedy of life, which is art, music, and compassion. And so embrace those 3 things. Making music is such a different thing from what we do every day in technology. So work out how you can include music in your life. Mine is a mixed bag because there are plenty of people who are talented singers, guitar players, pianists, and all those kind of things. So I go in and I have some fun. And yeah, I probably tweet a bit more about music than I do about AI at the moment. But you know what? It's one of the ways out of the misery of life. So if you don't like it, then I've inspired some reaction. If you do like it, great.
Love that. And that was, by the way, was the answer to the question, when are you at your happiest, which I think is quite telling. And I think most importantly, though, is what is the largest animal you think you could carry up a flight of stairs? And you went for a sheep, which is, a sheep can be fairly weighty. Andy, what would your answer to that be?
Well, I've had a lot of good examples from the team internally, obviously, that I get. Phil hasn't had the sort of the advantage of seeing, but for me, it was a chimpanzee because they'll hold on.
Yeah, chimpanzee will grasp. I reckon I could just about get a llama up a flight of stairs, personally.
Oh, no.
Long neck.
Really?
That's an angry sheep.
Yeah, I think that right there is our quote to end on. A llama is just an angry sheep. Thank you so much for listening to Wirelive episode 4, all about how to stop making bad decisions and a bit of a journey through data and AI. Phil, Andy, any final thoughts? Any shout outs? Anyone you want to thank or say hello to?
Come on, Phil.
Find yourself a digital sociologist and talk to them. They're the most interesting people in data and AI at the moment.
Good chat. And I'm sure if you want one, and you message Phil, I'm sure he'd be happy to introduce you to one, because that's not something I think most people would know where to start with. But a great idea all the same. And Andy?
In the spirit of people coming to a data and AI workshop for just the data, we're doing a lot of work at the moment in the team about doing a data strategy workshop and answering some of the points that came up in the discussion today as well, these kind of things. So stay tuned for work on that. And shout out to everyone listening.
Great stuff. Thank you so much, everybody. Thanks to Andy. Thanks to Phil for his bare backdropped, delightful attendance with us today, and for all the support he's given us over the years, and to everybody at Microsoft as well. Andy, thanks for being such an amazing member of the team and all the great work you do with our partners. And to all of you for listening, hopefully you've enjoyed today from the weird lockdown dystopia that you are no doubt in. And my camera almost caught fire with the 32-degree heat during the episode, but does seem to have just about stuck with it. From me, thanks very much, and do tune in next time for episode 5.